All right, let me try to show you Kayak Medic on the hammock forums asked me about this, and there may be some other videos out there kind of talking about some of these concepts. I've struggled to find them, and I kind of had to find my way into figuring out these concepts for myself. So I thought maybe I would write down what makes sense in my head so as to communicate it to you maybe more clearly. Maybe that'll be helpful, maybe it'll confuse, maybe someone else will correct me. But let me just tell you what I've figured out so far. Okay, so bear with me here. So if you have, first I'll start with the concept of differential cut, which you mentioned, but you kind of seem confused about pleats. But first, let's just kind of, just for other people too, just quickly talk about what we mean by differential cut and how it's important in underquilt design, as far as I'm aware. So if you have your hammock, or if you have a top quilt, for example, you have this kind of boxed type of enclosed material that you fill with down. And, laying down flat, you have a certain distance here, a certain loft, let's say it's 2.5 inches. And that's all fine and dandy. Now, if this distance from here to here is on both the inner and the outer shell the same. So let's just say that's called X. And that's the same distance. Let's say it's, in 48 inches, for example. That works fine. You might lay it on yourself, but as soon as the way that the geometry works or whatever, I'm a pharmacist. I'm pretty poor with like advanced math, so just keep that in mind. I'm not like Grizz or some of the other folks on the forum that are really good with math. But if you take this item and try to then bend it, let's say you take it and you do something like this with it, like that. Well, those distances are still the same. Now, when I drew this out this way, you can see what I did here. I sort of made the outer part, if you look at it, it's actually going to be longer. But in order to make it, I keep this thing. But what actually happens is if I kept this, both the inner and the outer X, is that you get something that looks probably more like that'll be normal, but then this will be like this. And you see a compression, instead of having that differential that comes down longer to keep your loft the same, this pulls in closer to the inner layer because it has to conform to that new shape. The inner and the outer shell being the same and trying to conform that to fit your geometry right and keep your loft won't work. You'll squeeze this area here, which tends to be about your butt. My first underquilt build, I did no lengthwise differential, but plenty of width, and it certainly did this way. And so if you try to take those, and that goes either way, even though I've showed it to show a lengthwise approach, that's looking from the head end to the feet. But if you were to look down this way and look at the hammock sort of, looking from the head down this way, it's the same kind of thing. It's just in a different direction. So, you don't lay on a flat cot. It actually kind of might do like that, wherever you're laying. So the same basic effect goes in both directions. So in both the length and the width, to some degree, you need the outer shell of the fabric to be a larger dimension in order to create that effect that it hangs and has a certain shape so it doesn't compress the loft that you're shooting for. Hopefully that'll make some basic sense. So that means that in the length and the width direction, because you're not just working on this flat surface like this, you need more fabric for the length and the width compared to the inner shell. So if your inner shell as a general rule is of a certain dimension, let's say that, your outer shell will need to be some degree, and that's kind of the question that is still up for grabs often, it'll have to be to some degree larger than the inner shell. And so, you know, how much it is, people can discuss it. I don't know. I mean, I'm basically using about a 10 to 15% number is what I've been using for both length and width so far. I'm still learning about it. Other people can chime in and say, I don't know. I feel like if you have too much differential, it just kind of wrinkles up in areas. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but wherever you do the pleats. So there's some other approaches that I'll mention that I've never tried that I'm generally aware of, but I don't understand them exactly. I won't get into it. You'll see in the forums if you Google about Jacks for Better uses a quote radial baffle. So, you know, I haven't gotten to the baffles, but the baffles have to fit in here and you know, so when you're looking down the head end and you were to look down the quilt, you know, the baffle shape is kind of this, is going to, if it's going a crosswise baffle instead of ones that go down the full length, Jacks for Better, you know, they're the ones that first ever said, you know, they cut their baffles to be this U shape. I kind of understand that, but I'm not sure how it really changes anything, because I guess you wouldn't have to do pleats. I'll come back to this in a minute. I guess you wouldn't have to do pleats on the baffles, but you still, they'd be really annoying to sew on. I'm not sure how that would work, but I'm not sure anyone else has tried to duplicate that basic process on the DIY side. But, you know, anyway, we'll come back to that. So, this basic idea of having a bigger dimension for length and width, because what you're going to ultimately do, though, and this is the trick, you take this bigger fabric, be it length or width or both or one or the other, and fit it within a smaller dimension. You can't just, you know, do that without doing something. The extra fabric's got to go somewhere. So what I've done, and what I think what a number of underquilts and people who build them do, when they fit these in order to make it fit, say along the outer shell, for example, is that you need to find little spots in different areas to add pleats. So you little fold over like this. So this, if you want to make this shorter, you just fold it over a bit. Okay? So you make a series of pleats so that this dimension then will match this dimension when you sew it on. Now, that's on the outer shell, and I mean, for me, for me, it's the pleats also need to go on each baffle. So if I take this outer shell over here and lay it out like this, I will need to, the baffles, let's just take one for example, it'll need to be a longer width. So if the inner shell original is say X and this is X plus 1, then the baffles also need to be X plus 1 in length. So the baffle here, that material, I'm going to draw a little three-dimensional of it here, a little no seam mesh. This will need to be cut the full length to match this outer one, and there's not going to be pleats needed for this one, it just is bigger. And then that sews down. This free side will be X plus 1 in length generally. And then you have to fit that now onto this inner shell, and it has to sew down on a corresponding location. And when you sew this down, though, it has extra fabric, so then you got to do something with it. So you do these pleats, and you'll have to do pleats on each of the baffles. And what I've found is you want to match the pleats on the outer shell with the inner, so that, because what you kind of get is a slight bunching up of the fabric in those areas when it lays flat. So when you're done and you've done all these pleats, you have a sort of little wrinkles or crinkles. I could show a picture later of a couple of my quilts laying down to show this. And then when you take it and hang it, it has that room to expand there. Those wrinkles will let you have that extra fabric to expand and not compress this area. So what I've done on this build I'm currently doing is I've marked ahead of time where all the pleats, actually on this side here, I mark, let's say I have this marked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever. Actually I had about 9 spots. And I mark them here and across the entire, and then across every one of the spots where baffles go on too, to match. And then when I sew down each of the baffle line, after one of these baffles down onto it, as I sew it, I'll pleat down in those spots. Pleat, 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 pleat. It's not that bad, really. It does add some complexity to your design and your planning, but if you don't do it and you're gonna lose compression. So I hope that helps your thought process. It's kind of trying to make something. It's kind of three-dimensional in the discussion. It's kind of hard to follow. There may be some other people that'll chime in and say, "Oh, well, you're making it more hard or something." I don't know, but I've built a few now, and now I feel like I'm kind of moving in the right direction. I can tell you that this works. If I do this, it won't cause a lot of compression if I do it with plenty of that, 15% about extra. And that's it. I do it for the length and the width. Now with the width, if I'm doing longitudinal baffles, it's not as too big of a deal. It just might mean I just need to kind of take up that extra fabric generally. Usually if I have a whole bunch of rows of these and I go to sew them down, just kind of a little pleat here and there in between each of them. Each of the baffles usually is about what I need. I don't think it's too big a deal. And that way it's happy all around. So that's my ramblings on the subject. Hopefully it will give you some clarity. The video I'll produce that shows all my process here pretty soon. I'm almost done with the quilt. Hopefully it'll give you some hands-on look at what I mean by this. But yeah, if you really can't just leave the baffles without having them pleated down either. So they have to have the differential within them too, to allow the same expansion when you hang it. So I think that for me that was the most confusing part when I thought about it. I'm not sure this is written in many places. I don't see a lot on the forums telling people how to do a differential cut. It just assumes everyone just kind of knows how to do it. So hopefully this will help you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.